every improvement in machinery throws workers out of employment, and the greater the advance, the more numerous the unemployed. Each great improvement produces, therefore, upon a number of workers the effect of a commercial crisis, creates want, wretchedness, and crime. Take a few examples. The very first invention, the jenny, worked by one man, produced at least sixfold what the spinning wheel had yielded in the same time. Thus every new jenny threw 5 spinners out of employment. The throstle, which, in turn, produced much more than the jenny, and like it, was worked by one man, threw still more people out of employment. The mule, which required yet fewer hands in proportion to the product, had the same effect, and every improvement in the mule, every multiplication of its spindles, diminished still further the number of workers employed. But this increase of the number of spindles in the mule, is so great that whole armies of workers have been thrown out of employment by it. For, whereas one spinner, with a couple of children for pieces, formerly set 600 spindles in motion, he could now manage 1,400 to 2,000 spindles upon 2 mules, so that 2 adult spinners and a part of the pieces whom they employed were thrown out. And since self-acting mules have been introduced into a very large number of spinning mills, the spinner's work is wholly performed by the machine. There lies before me a book from the pen of James Leach, 135, one of the recognized leaders of the Chartists in Manchester. The author has worked for years in various branches of industry, in mills and coal mines, and is known to me personally as an honest, trustworthy, and capable man. In consequence of his political position, he had at command extensive detailed information as to the different factories, collected by the workers themselves, and he publishes tables from which it is clear that in 1841, in 35 factories, 1,060 fewer mule spinners were employed than in 1829. Though the number of spindles in these 35 factories had increased by 99,239. He cites 5 factories in which no spinners whatever are employed, self-actors only being used. While the number of spindles increased by 10%, the number of spinners diminished more than 60%. And Leach adds that since 1841, so many improvements have been introduced by double-decking and other means, that in some of the factories named, half the operatives have been discharged. In one factory alone, where 80 spinners were employed a short time ago, there are now but 20 left, the others having been discharged, or set at children's work for children's wages. Of Stockport Leach tells a similar story, that in 1835, 800 spinners were employed, and in 1840, but 140, though the manufacture of Stockport has greatly increased during the last 8 or 9 years. Similar improvements have now been made in carding frames, by which 1/2 the operatives have been thrown out of employment. In one factory improved frames have been set up, which have thrown 4 hands out of 8 out of work, besides which the employer reduced the wages of the 4 retained from 8 shillings to 7. The same process has gone on in the weaving industry. The power loom has taken possession of one branch of hand weaving after another, and since it produces much more than the hand loom, while one weaver can work 2 looms, it has superseded a multitude of working people. And in all sorts of manufacture, in flax and wool spinning, in silk twisting, the case is the same. The power loom too, is beginning to appropriate one branch after another of wool and linen weaving. In Rochdale alone, there are more power than hand looms in flannel, and other wool weaving branches. The bourgeoisie usually replies to this, that improvements in machinery, by decreasing the cost of production, supply finished goods at lower prices, and that these reduced prices cause such an increase in consumption, that the unemployed operatives soon find full employment in newly founded factories. 136 The bourgeoisie is so far correct, that under certain conditions favorable for the general development of manufacture, every reduction in price of goods in which the raw material is cheap, greatly increases consumption, and gives rise to the building of new factories, but every further word of the assertion is a lie. The bourgeoisie ignores the fact that it takes years for these results of the decrease in price to follow, and for new factories to be built. It is silent upon the point that every improvement in machinery throws the real work, the expenditure of force, more and more upon the machine, and so transforms the work of full-grown men into mere supervision, which a feeble woman or even a child can do quite as well. and us for half or two-thirds wages, that, therefore, grown men are constantly more and more supplanted, and not re-employed by the increase in manufacture. It conceals the fact that whole branches of industry fall away, or are so changed, that they must be learned afresh, and it takes good care not to confess what it usually harps upon, whenever the question of forbidding the work of children is broached. That factory work must be learned in earliest youth, in order to be learned properly. It does not mention the fact that the process of improvement goes steadily on, and that as soon as the operative has succeeded in making himself at home in a new branch, if he actually does succeed in so doing, this too is taken from him, and with it the last remnant of security which remained to him for winning his bread. But the bourgeoisie gets the benefit of the improvements in machinery. It has a capital opportunity for piling up money during the first years, while many old machines are still in use, and the improvement not yet universally introduced, and it would be too much to ask that it should have an open eye for the disadvantages inseparable from these improvements. The fact that improved machinery reduces wages has also been as violently disputed by the bourgeoisie, as it is constantly reiterated by the working men. The bourgeoisie insists that, although the price of piecework has been reduced, yet the total of wages for the week's work has rather risen than fallen, and the condition of the operatives rather improved than deteriorated. It is hard to get to the bottom of the matter, for the operatives usually dwell upon the price of piecework. But it is certain that the weekly wage, also, has, in many branches of work, been reduced by the improvement of machinery. The so-called fine spinners who spin fine mule yarn, for instance, do receive high wages, 30 to 40 shillings a week, because they have a powerful association for keeping wages up, and their craft requires long training. But the coarse spinners who have to compete against cell-factors which are not as yet adapted for fine spinning, and whose association was broken down by the introduction of these machines, receive very low wages. A mule spinner told me that he does not earn more than 14 shillings a week, and his statement agrees with that of Leach, that in various factories the coarse spinners earn less than 16 shillings and sixpence a week, and that a spinner, who years ago earned 30 shillings, can now hardly scrape up 12 and a half, and had not earned more on an average in the past year. The wages of women and children may perhaps have fallen less, but only because they were not high from the beginning. I know several women, widows with children, who have trouble enough to earn 8 to 9 shillings a week, and that they and their families cannot live decently upon that sum. Everyone must admit who knows the price of the barest necessaries of life in England. That wages in general have been reduced by the improvement of machinery is the unanimous testimony of the operatives. The bourgeois assertion that the condition of the working class has been improved by machinery is most vigorously proclaimed a falsehood in every meeting of working men in the factory districts. And even if it were true that the relative wage, the price of piecework only, has fallen, while the absolute wage, the sum to be earned in the week, remained unchanged, what would follow? That the operatives have had quietly to look on while the manufacturers filled their purses from every improvement without giving the hands the smallest share in the gain. The bourgeois forgets, in fighting the working man, the most ordinary principles of his own political economy. He who at other times swears by Malthus, cries out in his anxiety before the workers, where could the millions by which the population of England has increased find work, without the improvements in machinery? 138. As though the bourgeois did not know well enough, that without machinery and the expansion of industry which it produced, these millions would never have been brought into the world and grown up. The service which machinery has rendered the workers is simply this, that it has brought home to their minds the necessity of a social reform by means of which machinery shall no longer work against but for them. Let the wise bourgeois ask the people who sweep the streets in Manchester and elsewhere, though even this is past now, since machines for the purpose have been invented and introduced, or sell salt, matches, oranges, and shoestrings on the streets, or even beg, what they were formerly, and he will see how many will answer mill hands thrown out of work by machinery. The consequences of improvement in machinery under our present social conditions are, for the working man, solely injurious, and often in the highest degree oppressive. Every new advance brings with it loss of employment, want, and suffering, and in a country like England where, without that, there is usually a surplus population, to be discharged from work is the worst that can befall the operative. And what a dispiriting, unnerving influence this uncertainty of his position in life, consequent upon the unceasing progress of machinery, must exercise upon the worker, whose lot is precarious enough without it. To escape despair, there are but two ways open to him, either inward and outward revolt against the bourgeoisie or drunkenness and general demoralization. And the English operatives are accustomed to take refuge in both. The history of the English proletariat relates hundreds of uprisings against machinery and the bourgeoisie.